Hello everybody and welcome to another of Alan Romson's Grisly Tales. I hope you're well. I hope you are getting through the troubled times that we've been having and things are easing up somewhat in your life. However, we stay grisly. And we're starting off with something about celebrities. Now, whether you realise it or not, an awful lot of celebrities have ended up being charged with murder, in some cases for absolutely heinous crimes. You may well be aware that Snoop Dogg, along with his bodyguard, were charged with murder for the shooting and killing of a guy called Philip Waldemariam. He was a rival gang member, and that was back in 1993. Snoop's bodyguard was acquitted pretty much as soon as the case went to court, because his team of solicitors said that he fired at Waldemariam out of self-defense because Waldemariam was aiming guns at them. So, he was acquitted. But Snoop was involved in the case far, far longer. In fact, it took 3 years of court cases until he was acquitted of the charges in 1996. Now, if ever you've watched a great TV series called The Shield, I thought that was a top show. One of the actors from The Shield, a man called Michael Jace, got himself arrested in 2014 at his home in Los Angeles for murdering his wife. April Jace was shot dead in front of their 2 children, and it was the actor, Michael Jace himself, who rang the police to report the incident. When the police got there, he explained that he was upset with his wife. He thought that she was cheating on him, and he ended up getting convicted of second-degree murder by a jury in 2016. Now, when punk burst onto the scene, a lot of people got really excited. It was the chance for people to have a go, to have a bash at something that they'd never tried before, a new aggressive style of music. However, that went tragically too far for the Sex Pistols bass player Sid Vicious. He ended up getting charged with murder for stabbing his girlfriend Nancy Spungen to death. In 1979, they were in New York after the band had just broken up. Vicious was found by police in the hallway in a completely delusional drug mess, and he admitted straight away that he had slayed his longtime girlfriend Spungen. Yet, he was to die himself only 7 weeks later. When he was out on bail, he attended a party and he overdosed on heroin. Now, one of the best all-time kind of teen films was a movie called Ferris Bueller's Day Off. And back in 1987, the star of that film, Matthew Broderick, and his then-girlfriend Jennifer Grey from Dirty Dancing, they were on holiday in Ireland. Broderick completely forgot that he wasn't driving in America, and he drove quite quickly on the wrong side of a street and crashed into an oncoming vehicle. The driver and their passenger in the other car both died from their injuries. Then, of course, Leslie Grantham. A lot of people have heard the story about him shooting a taxi driver dead, and yet he still went on to become a major star in EastEnders. It happened a long time ago. It was in December of 1966. Leslie Grantham decided he was going to rob a taxi driver, and the taxi driver he chose was a man called Felix Reese, and he was in Osnabrück in West Germany. The taxi driver wasn't going to take it lightly, and there was a struggle between the two men. Reese ended up dying after being shot in the head. However, at Grantham's trial in 1967, he was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Yet fate and karma has a habit of coming around, And Leslie Grantham, just before he died at the age of 71, told everyone how he had been jailed for murder, how he was sacked over a sex scandal and left totally homeless by divorce. He was a little-known actor trying to turn his life around, but things had to happen to make him pay. It's how the world works. I know we're talking about celebrities, but I think politicians and their wives have a fair place here too. George Bush Sr.'s wife, Laura Bush, when she was in high school, she was driving a car given to her by her parents, and she failed to stop at a stop sign when she was driving. She hit another car and killed the driver, Michael Dutton Douglas, who happened to be one of her closest friends and one of her classmates. Many people have watched Caitlyn Jenner in various reality shows. She was an Olympic champion at one time, and obviously now still a reality star, and yet she got involved in a fatal car accident too, on the Malibu stretch of road in February 2015. According to eyewitnesses, Jenner's four-wheel drive car rear-ended a white car and sent it spinning into oncoming traffic. It was then hit by a Hummer, and the driver of that white car was killed, and 7 other people sustaining injuries. Jenner was not hurt in the wreck. When the police got there, she voluntarily submitted to have blood drawn for a blood alcohol test, and she said she wasn't speeding at the time. And after passing a field sobriety test, she told the police that she was being chased by the paparazzi, but the police did not believe that to be true. Jenner would later release a statement saying, "My heartfelt and deepest sympathies go out to the family and the loved ones, and to all of those who were involved or injured in this terrible accident. It is a devastating tragedy, and I cannot pretend to imagine what this family is going through at this time. I am praying for them, and I will continue to cooperate in every way possible." Jenner was never charged. From the world of sport, we've got Venus Williams, tennis star, another one having a horrific, fatal and tragic car accident in June 2017, leaving one man dead. She was driving in Palm Beach Gardens, Florida, when she rushed into an intersection despite not having the right of way, and she was T-boned by the car. The car's driver survived, but the lady's husband, a 78-year-old man, was sent to the intensive care unit, where he would die 2 weeks later. Now, Tupac Shakur was one of the best and most famous and still most popular artists in the world of hip-hop. His lyrics, quite often about politics, showed somebody that had a lot of guts to put his opinions out there. He was artistically sensitive, and it was in between that bombastic nature of his art and the sensitive soul that he was that caused him fame and also caused him tragedy. Shakur had been part of the East Coast West Coast feud with the New York rapper Biggie Smalls, but the arguments became so heated that a lot of people believe it led to the murder of Tupac. After leaving a boxing match in Las Vegas in Associate Huge Knight's BMW, Shakur was shot 4 times by an unknown shooter and would later die from internal bleeding at a local hospital. He was only 25 years of age. The first suspect, Orlando Anderson, was a notorious member of the LA street gang, the Crips. He was cleared by the police. Biggie Smalls emphatically denied any involvement and was never charged. And the FBI also investigated the Jewish Defense League for issuing death threats against Tupac. But all to no avail. No one to this day has any idea who killed him. Yet, you could argue what goes around comes around, because Biggie Smalls, who's really Christopher George Latour Wallace, the notorious B.I.G., was one of New York's big stars. His style made him stand out. but he would also die at a young age from gunshot wounds. He was attending the 1997 Soul Train Music Awards when that West-East Coast gang war began to ferment in the crowd, with a lot of people in that crowd still holding Biggie responsible for the death of Tupac. After leaving the award ceremony, Wallace was shot at a red light by a man wielding a 9mm blue steel pistol. He suffered 4 bullet wounds to the chest, and he died shortly after reaching the Cesar Sinai Hospital in LA. Like Tupac Shakur, his murder is unsolved too. Suge Knight was an initial suspect, never charged. And in a recent interview, Biggie's mom stated that she thinks she knows who killed him, but blamed the Los Angeles Police Department for covering up the investigation as part of a corruption scandal in the 90s. We will probably never find out exactly what happened there. Now, there are lots of other famous people. If you're a fan of hard rock, Pantera's Dimebag Darrell Abbott was one of the greatest guitarists in metal history. He mixed Texas blues and that snarl that Black Sabbath had, and spurred his band to greatness throughout the 1990s. But the band folded in 2003, and everybody wondered what was next for this superstar guitar player. He went on to form another band, Damage Plan, with his brother and drummer Vinnie Paul. And during a 2004 tour, they visited Columbus, Ohio, where Dimebag was attacked by a former Marine called Nathan Gale. Abbott, Dimebag Darrell, was shot 5 times in the head from Gale's Beretta, dying instantly. Gale went on to kill 3 bystanders and wound 7 others before the police arrived and shot him dead. Although the reasons for Gale's attack have never been fully understood, there is a theory that keeps going round, is that he was actually upset that Pantera split up, blaming Dimebag and his brother. Other trains of thought say that he thought the guitarist had stolen one of his songs, but both reasons seem totally wrong, senseless, and just plain cruel, robbing the world of a true guitar hero. I don't know about you, but even if you don't particularly like hip-hop, you still love Run DMC. Always had a place for them. They're funny, they're quirky, they're heads down and charged kind of musicians. And Jam Master Jay, whose real name was Jason William Mizell, he was the DJ who helped run DMC and put them on the map as one of the best bands in hip-hop. He sampled bits of guitar, rock guitar usually, and he put it over rap beats. Everybody knows of the mix they did. Aerosmith, Run DMC, Walk This Way. And Mizell's death is all the more puzzling because everybody kind of liked Run DMC. Yet he was shot to death in October 2002 whilst over in Jamaica. He was at the Queen's recording studio and someone came in there. A lot of suspects have been named, and including an associate of Tupac Shakur, Tenard Washington. But the court papers declared that Washington pointed his gun at those present in the studio, ordered them to get on the ground, and provided cover for his associate to shoot and kill Jason Mizell, better known as Jam Master Jay. Yet Washington, surprisingly, was never even convicted, and Mizell's murder remains an open investigation. What a blasted shame. Such an amazing talent to come to such a horrific end for nothing. And speaking of absolute international world superstars, Marvin Gaye, one of the greatest singers of all time, he managed to fuse soul, R&B, jazz and funk. But like so many of the greats, this Tamla Motown superstar had a really mixed up, troubled personal life. He had to, as a child, endure child abuse. Throughout his life, he struggled with depression. To try and get rid of the depression, he took drugs. That led to drug addiction. And at one point, he even tried committing suicide. Unfortunately, one of the founders of Motown, Berry Gordy, intervened before he could follow through with the act. So once he got through there and all of the hits started coming, he heard it through the grapevine. Abraham, Martin and John, Let's Get It On. Amazing songs. Surely, all of that was long gone and now he was in a good place. But he also had a strained relationship with his parents. And that came to a head in 1984. The singer got into a physical altercation with his dad, Marvin Gaye Sr., in an attempt to break up a fight between him and his mother. And shortly after that, his father walked into the room and shot him dead. Incredibly, Gaye's father received just a 6-year suspended sentence with probation, with his charges dropped from first-degree murder to voluntary manslaughter after it was revealed that a brain tumour might have contributed to his unstable behaviour. This next murder was as heinous as a murder can be, and it sort of involves the Beatles. The 1969 murder of Sharon Tate was one of the most disturbing and horrific crime stories in all of America's history. She was a beautiful young actress, and she was at her Los Angeles home when they got attacked by Tex Watson, Patricia Krenwinkel, Linda Kasabian, and Susan Atkins, members of Charles Manson's so-called family. Tate, bless her, was 2 weeks from giving birth at the time. She pleaded for her life, but she was stabbed 16 times. The police thought they were trying to cut out the child. She would die from her wounds, as would the unborn child. In all, 10 people were murdered over a 2-day period by this murderous cult. It created panic, media frenzy, unparalleled at the time, and it turned Charles Manson into a household name. Now, Charles Manson orchestrated all of this, but he didn't carry out any of the killings, and his brainwashed followers and himself became a 3-ring circus in the press, with cult members vocally disrupting the proceedings, showing a complete disregard for all human life. In the end, Charles Manson, a man who wanted to be a rock star himself, turned criminal Svengali to organised death, and he was sentenced to life in prison. He's had various attempts at getting parole, bringing all of his grisly crimes back in the spotlight, time and time again. So how are the Beatles involved? Well, the Beatles had just released a new double CD, in my opinion, probably their greatest album of all time, called The White Album. And Manson believed that secret messages from the Beatles were being sent to him. During the killings, he told his followers to write certain words on the wall, one of them Piggies, the name of one of the songs from the White Album. He also often mentioned that this night of death was the night of Helter Skelter, another tune from that album. The Beatles, innocent of all crimes, just putting out their artistic works for it to be misused and misinterpreted by a psychopath. Now, everybody knows that O.J. Simpson was not convicted of murdering his wife. On the surface of it, O.J. Simpson and Nicole Brown Simpson had the best of the world, the perfect marriage. Lots of money coming in, fame, land, beautiful clothes, everything that you would imagine a couple could possibly want. Every photograph taken of them, they appeared to be the perfect happy couple, always smiling. And yet the truth couldn't have been further from the case. They had an awful abusive relationship that often turned physical. And with O.J. Simpson pleading no contest to spousal abuse in 1989, they ended up divorcing soon afterwards. But then they attempted to get back together, a mistake that battered women often make. But it didn't last long. Nicole Brown Simpson was found murdered on the 13th of June in 1994 outside her home in the Brentwood area of Los Angeles, having been stabbed multiple times. Beside her was the body of Ron Goldman, also stabbed to death. And now, America was a press furore. O.J. Simpson, the primary suspect in the trial of a century. A legal case that, even to this day, divides the court of public opinion on racial lines. Some people say they selected him to be guilty because of his colour, and that dominated TV news. And in the end, Simpson was acquitted in a criminal trial, but later found guilty in a civic suit when he was sentenced to prison for unrelated crimes in 2008. A lot of people saw that as karma coming round again. And I don't know about you, but it's celebrity murders that I always think kind of rattle my cage more than hearing that someone local's been killed. Because it kind of shows you that nobody is invulnerable, even if they've got fame and riches and massive walls and armed guards. And it's also because in this particular case, fans like me, I loved this man. He was an inspiration. And people would draw solace from the music that they left behind. The separation of taking the talent away from the audience, I think, is just a heartbreaking thing. I cried on the day that I heard that John Lennon was dead. He was the voice of my generation. And the ex-Beatles singer and guitar player was murdered by Mark David Chapman. He'd actually previously that day been asked by Chapman to sign a copy of his album Double Fantasy outside Lennon's New York City apartment building. And Lennon asked Chapman, "Is that all that you want?" And sadly the answer was no. Chapman returned to John Lennon's building on the 8th of December, shooting him 4 times, and he blamed his actions on the book The Catcher in the Rye, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Everybody remembered where they were the day that John Lennon was killed, and the response was overwhelming. The whole world mourning the death of an absolute superstar. Lennon, John F. Kennedy, and Martin Luther King. For a singer who told the world to love each other, a singer who supported pacifism, the way that he died seems especially cruel. Celebrities who killed, celebrities who were killed. That's a dark beginning to tonight's Grisly Tales. So let's get down to the nitty-gritty and tell you the story of the Pooley Bridge poltergeist. A very rare type of poltergeist managed to drive a family from Pooley Bridge back in the 1950s. It was a family called Ross, and they moved into a small cottage on the outskirts of the village. They'd moved from Hexham to the even more tranquil banks of Ullswater. It was a major leap of faith. John Ross had retired, his wife was an accountant, and would seek to find small businesses that she could work for in that area, as she had in Hexham, Corbridge and Wylam. So they downsized. They just wanted a simple, quiet life. Yet on the very first day of moving in, they became aware of something in the attic of the house. they could hear very gentle padding of steps, nothing bulky like a man or a woman, but could it be a rat or maybe a teenager trying to break in? They had been burgled twice in Hexham, so had moved to make sure that it never happened again. So John got his aluminium ladders and pulled open the wooden hatch, and there was a strange smell. He shone the torch around, but he couldn't see anything. He climbed half in and shone the torch to the four corners, and apart from a few boxes and dirty, yellowing insulation, there was nothing up there. What had that noise been? Over the next few months, the noise became commonplace. The Ross couple had to put up with it. And then, two things happened on the same week, both extraordinary and coincidental. Joyce Ross was driving her little Fiat home when she hit a huge Alsatian that had run out from the bushes. It was flung back into the trees. Joyce got out and followed its tragic trajectory into the woods, certain that she'd killed it. To her surprise, her little car wasn't damaged. There was a little fur and blood on the grill, but it was in one piece. As she tentatively looked around the wood for the body of this huge animal, yet there was nothing there. Relieved, she got back into her car and drove away, thinking it must have just been clipped and had survived well enough to run off. Well, once she got home, they were both relaxing in the garden with a glass of wine to calm her nerves when they heard a strange crying sound. The problem was, it was coming from their house. And once again, they checked to make sure that nobody was in there. Month after month, more noise, howling, roaring, growling, every kind of sound known to man, and the worst, a quiet sobbing. And that they found most unsettling. It was as if a baby was trapped and needed help. Eventually, they decided to move into Alston, to a property that didn't have any ghostly baggage. They told their friend who owned a gift shop, "There was a dead spirit plaguing us. We are both too old to deal with stuff like that." They sold the property for roughly what they'd paid for it, just to get out of the damn place. In the late 1960s, a man called Bell moved in. And it all started for him too. But he was a big chap, ex-army, not easily swayed and certainly not believing in ghosts. He put up with the noises for just so long, then decided to strip back the furniture to find out where this noise was coming from. After pulling his own home to bits, he found himself in that dark, rather bleak attic with only a tiny torch to help him look. He moved all the boxes, then began reaching down under the filthy yellow fiberglass insulation. He disturbed the odd spider that made him jump, and then he found his hand on something quite smooth and strangely cold. There, under that minging yellowy layer, was the mummified body of a huge dog. It was a huge creature with its grinning skull staring out at Bell. He jumped backwards and had to gather himself and began to pull it out. Some bones fell off the animal. He collected them all in a box and took them outside. He walked along to Ullswater and he threw the bones in. He thought a funeral at sea, or lake, was the right thing to do. Yet the following day the noises were even worse. Bell had found himself a job with the Forestry Commission, so he was out early, but he left a cassette recorder on, recording to catch whatever there was in his new country home. He thought he was going mad, but on getting back, the tape had the noises captured for the world to hear. I've got a copy of the noises. First it's quite quiet, merely the hiss of the tape, and then what sounds like dogs padding around on a hard floor. Then there was a bit of a whine. By this time, Bell began pulling the house apart again, even lifted floorboards up and looked under the floor. And as the tape recorder in his hand kept playing, he moved back some of the parquet flooring, and underneath the carpet he found a hole easily big enough for something to crawl through. And just as he looked down, he peered into the darkness, and the tape was quiet again. He looked into the dark, and he thought he could see something moving. Just then, the most gigantic growl from the tape. Bell lifted his head up, slicing his ear with a nail. And this is one of only a handful of poltergeist dog stories from anywhere in Britain. That house was later abandoned, slowly becoming overtaken by the forest, and much of it currently is falling down. Once Bell moved out and the tape was played on television, no one else ever dared even to go there. So now, a story of daring do, I suppose, from World War II, demonstrating the flying spirit of the glory that is the North. Across our part of the world, we have numerous incredible stories of courage, from the massive number of airfields that sprouted up during World War II, and following the fall of Poland and Britain entering the conflict. The northeast was swamped with Polish people desperate for revenge against their Nazi oppressors. Thousands joined the forces, many as trainee pilots. Yet long before they were fully trained, they were known to steal a fighter and fly across and attack as many German planes, ships or bases as they could. This was so common that when a new training bomber, a Manchester, was delivered to Morpeth's airfield, in beautiful condition and with a painting of Dopey from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs on the side, the very first thing they did was to remove the outer wing panels and two of its engines to deter the Polish aviators from stealing it for another unofficial bombing raid over Germany. At Acklington, a major training area in Northumberland, countless craft were damaged or destroyed. And in August 1939, a group of SEALs, three-seater biplanes, were learning formation flying when two planes collided in mid-air and crashed at Beal, near Berwick-upon-Tweed. The crash was such an inferno that three human bodies were fused together and couldn't be separated for identification. A third pilot decided to land near the wreck to search for survivors. However, in landing, he hit an obstruction and ended up exploding into flames right next to the crash site. And it is this man who's there to this day. His ghost is known as Cheery Charlie, and it's often seen walking across the field in search of his fallen comrades. He was a Pole called Chasinski, known for laughing no matter what anybody ever said to him. A family from Beal called Douglas said in 1941, "Ever since the three planes crashed on our backfield, we can't get off to sleep. Every evening we hear someone screaming with laughter from the field, and we've seen this man a few times, yet if you race towards him, he just disappears. On 2 occasions, my husband has been so sick of not getting enough sleep, he actually fired his shotgun at him. There's certainly something there, and it's not pleasant when if you work on farms you need to be up at 5:30 every morning." And in October 1939, a flight of Gloucester Gladiators flew from Acklington on patrol and shot down a German Dornier flying boat 40 miles east of Berwick. The Gladiators would return to join Spitfires to create the 152 Squadron, and later that month Britain's other superplane, the Hurricane, arrived to build a very efficient squadron. And whilst there, during another patrol, a group of Heinkel bombers was spotted trying to cross the British coast, and within seconds a bomber was peppered by their machine guns and spiralling into flames in the dark North Sea. A second Hurricane Squadron, known as the Flying Cocks, arrived at Acklington, gaining their name with massive success, flying planes called Gloucester Gamecocks. This unit was so masterful that even on their way to Acklington from Wick in Scotland, they ended up getting into a dogfight and shot down 5 Heinkel bombers. One of these being the very first enemy plane ever to crash on British soil, roughly where Stannington Village stands today. Every day they were called upon for what they called earning their corn. A Coble, a northeastern fishing boat, was under fire from a German bomber that just kept machine gunning them. Within minutes, it seemed, 3 planes were scrambled, and the Hurricanes were off after this Heinkel. The first run killed a rear gunner, and the right front engine was in flames. The other 2 planes raked the bomber, and it was inevitably going down. The fishermen on the trawler were all cheering and waving as the German plane crash-landed on Baniel Flat Farm, north of Whitby. 2 of the crew were dead. The other 2 managed to survive. The pilot, called H. Wilms, and the radio officer, K. Missy, both were arrested and imprisoned for the rest of the war for shooting at civilians. The Germans, obviously, had more aircraft and far more general military strength, and often that would lead to their arrogance and overconfidence. In August 1940, 65 Heinkel bombers were sent to destroy industrial targets across Tyneside and any airfields they could find, aiming particularly for Vickers Armstrongs along Scotswood Road, where, incidentally, my mum was working building shells. These 65 Heinkels were escorted by a full squadron of Messerschmitts, making it over 90 aircraft in all. The bandits were seen by spotters who believed it could be the forerunner of the invasion. So the Hurricanes flew much higher, hid themselves in the sun's rays before choosing their individual targets. Then, on revving their engines, they sped down into the fray. Now, Heinkels had no rear gunners because they were supported by fighters. They decided this to try and make the plane lighter, and this would prove fatal for most of them. Over 40 of their planes were destroyed. The others were deterred from moving forward, and they jettisoned their bombs, mostly over the sea or over farmland. Yet the northern air bases were the main training area for Spitfire pilots, zooming around the valleys and mountain passes of Northumberland and up and around the Scottish Highlands. Yet one of Amble's main ghostly sightings was following the exploits of an Acklington pilot called Flight Lieutenant D. Sheen. The Luftwaffe had decided to create what they called a reign of terror across Britain to soften up the towns and cities prior to invasion. So German planes would firebomb ordinary people, not just industrial or military targets, the public. So as Flight Lieutenant Sheen increased the number of hours learning about his nippy Spitfire, while he was training he spotted a Junkers Ju-88A5, and as it had been dropping bombs on the good people of Amble, he decided he was going to take it out. Now, some say it was against his orders, yet after 2 passes, the German twin-engine bomber was falling to earth in a sheet of flames. Locals ran out to celebrate the destruction of the aircraft that had been attacking them. And there, sitting in the pilot's seat, was a body burning at the wheel. Yet the other 3 crew were never found. Yet from its crash up until the late 1960s, people regularly saw the spirits of 4 foreign aviators around the Acklington Road area of Amble, along Bisley Road especially. Builders constructing the James Calvert Spence College claimed to have seen these 4 figures wearing a foreign military uniform, on a nightly basis. And every time they saw them, they say they could also smell a sour, burning, petrol and human flesh kind of smell. Now, I think most of you know that I like to delve into real history to find grisly stories and true stories of famous people that we all think we know everything about, and yet as soon as you look into it you realise you knew nothing at all. Despite numerous films, that is the case about the death of Custer. I'm going to tell you the story of the gathering of the Massacred from Montana in the United States of America. Everybody thinks they know all about the so-called Battle of the Little Bighorn, but they really don't. Firstly, it didn't happen on the Little Bighorn. It happened almost 3 miles from there, on a marshy area that the Lakota, Arapaho and Cheyenne all called the Greasy Grass. Most of us have been trained by TV and film to believe that the cavalry were completely wiped out, and this is far from the truth. But it was probably the most significant battle of the Great Sioux War of 1876, taking place over 2 full days in June. The Native American Indians had decided en masse that they would not be apportioned an area of barren mountain or a tiny scrap of scrubland for their valiant people to starve to death. There had been horrific massacres where Native American encampments were flattened and every man, woman and children killed, babies carried out of the camp on bayonets, women raped, babies stamped to death, while the soldiers mutilated the men, riding off with their heads, arms and legs on their lances. The Sundance Gathering of 1876 brought all of the tribes together, and their leaders all knew that it was likely that they would be wiped out by the constant flood of white colonialists and the armies sent to defend them. Following the Civil War, the 7th Cavalry were created, and the man in charge was an experienced Indian fighter, Lieutenant George Armstrong Custer. Now, the press at the time labelled him a hero, yet one of his earliest so-called victories was the routing of Black Kettle's Cheyenne camp on the Washita River. In Washington, there was a painting and it showed Custer riding towards massive swathes of those redskins. Yet the truth was that Black Kettle, the chief, and all of his warriors were 40 miles away when Custer rode in. The camp only had old men, women and children. Even the President's Indian Bureau declared it to be a massacre of innocent Indians. But back then, such was the hatred engendered against the native population. The press always made everything their fault. Then came the Battle of Rosebud, when a detachment of soldiers accidentally rode into an unusually large gathering of Native Americans. Now, General Crook had lost a lot of men, so he decided to retreat, totally unaware that another 500 men under General Terry were riding towards them. By the time they arrived, Crook and all of his men had left. Now, they knew that there were masses of Native Americans gathering, more than they could ever have imagined. Yet none chose to tell Longhair, Custer. So Custer led his 7th Cavalry towards these savages, believing that he outnumbered them 2-1 with the help of Terry and Crook. Yet the native Red Indians were far cleverer than the soldiers, having left one single teepee near where Rosebud had taken place. This was a landmark that the Indians had placed so everyone else could be gauged from it. The tent held the body of a dead Sans Arc warrior called Old She-Bear, who had been badly wounded and had died the next day. Sitting Bull believed that during the battle he could see the spirit of Old She-Bear dragging soldiers from their horses and leading the fight. The Native Americans used that one landmark to guide their men, and Custer never realized it. On the first day of the battle, Reno crossed the Little Bighorn along Reno's Creek as it's known today. Having blown bugles to announce their coming, they expected to come across families running away. Instead, the camp was full of the Hunkpapa Sioux. Some of his own native Indian scouts ran back to announce it was all a trap. So he stopped short of the camp and his men dug in. Reno's men kept firing blindly into empty tents. The only people in there was the occasional woman who was shot. Yet a Native American chief, Chief Gall, his wives and children, said that they refused to leave the camp, and they were killed in that attack. This enraged the Hunkpapa Sioux, and they regrouped. They set fire to the dry shrubland that the soldiers were dug into. Reno dived onto his horse and said, "Come on, men, follow me, let's get out of here." It was a disorderly and costly retreat. He lost 3 of his best officers and 29 men. Another officer and 18 men were captured and burned alive. Had Reno held his ground, and he could have, the day's events would have been very different. However, Reno was standing talking to his head scout, Bloody Knife, when a shot blew the top of his head off, spattering Reno with his scout's blood. Reno was straight onto his horse, and he was off home. Yet around this time, Custer had sent a message to Benteen's battalion saying, "Quickly, come to us and bring packs to Big Village." When a regiment fired volleys, it was a message to any other regiments to rush to their aid, and distinct volleys were being fired. But instead, Benteen got his men to reinforce Reno's ragtag gathering on the top of the bluff and help them escape. At Weir Ridge, not Little Bighorn, Custer had ridden by accident into this enormous group of Native Americans, over 40 tribes deep. The area is now known as Last Stand Hill, or the site of Custer's last stand. Custer's most trusted officer, Miles Keogh, had struck out with a battalion and hoped to create 2 areas of fighting. Instead, he found himself completely surrounded by some of the greatest battle strategists that the world has ever known. There before him was Crazy Horse, White Bull, Hump, and other Native American chiefs. So Benteen, who'd been shot in the heel, held his ground and fought back the various Native Americans crawling through the grass in an attempt to finish them off. In the distance, where Custer had been fighting, all had fallen silent. A lot of people in the distance believed that Custer was obviously won, and he would be riding up to reinforce them any time. Yet they were still over 3 miles away, stripped of their clothing and ritually mutilated. The 7th Cavalry lost all 210 men, massacred by the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne. The Native American Indians had carried off all of their dead, leaving the troops to begin decomposing, making identification impossible. And not one person came for the bodies until they'd been lying there for almost 4 days. They were identified as best they could and buried pretty much where they lay. George Armstrong Custer, guilty of many a massacre of innocents, had been given a one of his own. He had a bullet wound in his chest and had bled out. Later, a chief believed to be Crazy Horse put a bullet in his temple too, ripping open his entire skull. In many Native American accounts, they saw soldiers committing suicide all over the battlefield rather than being captured and tortured. There, on Last Stand Hill, there's a memorial to the 7th Cavalry, a huge obelisk with the names of all the dead. Custer's Crow Scout Charlie had been ordered away near Medicine Tail Coulee. He survived, and he said that he had told Custer one of the Indian camps just had women and children in it, but Custer had insisted attacking it. So his death may have been a necessity of fate, or that karma we keep talking about. A Lakota warrior known as Big Nose said that he had shot Custer in the chest. The Cheyenne believe a warrior called Buffalo Calf Road Woman had knocked Custer off his horse, allowing Big Nose to shoot him. It is also believed that far from 2 days, Custer and his cavalry were dispatched within hours of the conflict beginning. Captain Frederick Benteen went over Custer's battle area saying it was a rout, it was a panic until the last man was killed. In archaeological work carried out in 1985, they discovered a number of stone mallets with a rawhide handle. They were used by the women of the tribe to finish off any of the wounded. The 7th Cavalry trumpet is currently on display in Camp Verde, Arizona. The Oglala Sioux warrior Black Elk said, "After Custer, it was the great exodus. We fled all night. My 2 younger brothers and I rode in a pony drag, and our mother put some young pups in there with us. We spent the whole night trying to stop them crawling out. Eventually, Sitting Bull escaped to Canada. Crazy Horse surrendered at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, and the Great Sioux War ended after Miles defeated the Miniconjou Sioux, all but wiping out the tribe. For years, people kept appearing, saying that they were the survivor of Custer's last battle, but they were always disproven. The Native Americans always insisted that they took no prisoners, and if they did, they were tortured and killed on the very first night. They did find 3 charred and burnt soldiers' bodies in a village where a big war dance had taken place. They had been tied to the ground and a fire lit between their legs. The only true survivor of this battle, not of the Little Bighorn, was Comanche, the horse belonging to Captain Miles Keogh. In fact, over the years, a good few thousand people believe they've seen this horse's ghost riding across the battlefield, usually with blood dripping across his back and with an arrow in its rear flank. The ghost of General George Armstrong Custer is also said to be occasionally seen on a foggy dusk, there standing in bright blue, no hat, just long blonde hair, striding around in search of the 2 battalions that he waited to support him. One from Reno, one from Benteen. "I fell asleep in the car," said Ed Fogarty. "It was August 2007. I was parked overlooking the battle site, and on waking, I noticed how it was much darker, and there in the distance was a man in a blue cavalry uniform. He had blonde hair right down his back, and he was crying out for help." Fogarty actually got out to run to his aid and reached out to grab his arm, only for his arm to go straight through him. And that is our Grisly Tales for tonight, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Don't forget, a whole host of things wait for you on robsonsworld.com, including some incredible stories of the likes of Rasputin and Dracula and Sony Bean, the cannibal killer. There's a lot of places you could visit. And don't forget, if you can help us in any shape or form, there's a donation page on the front of robsonsworld.com too. Any help you can give us will help keep us going. We thank you sincerely. And until we are together again, from me, Alan Robson, God bless you, and I wish you well.